Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the second session of this morning entitled Sayfo Narratives. The lectures include poetry and music areas which play a very important role for preserving identity, and I think this is very, very necessary for a nation without country, but it is a nation with immense, important cultural heritage. I'm very blessed to welcome our speakers. Thank you for coming to this conference. The first speaker is Naus Atto, and her paper is entitled Singing the Sayfo in the Diaspora. Naus Atto is Mellon postdoctoral fellow at the University of Cambridge and PI in the Aramaic online project. She received her PhD from Leiden University in 2011. Her latest publication is The Myth of an Ideal Leader, the case of the Syriac Orthodox community in Europe in Maya and Hemali, Orthodox identities in contemporary Western Europe, migration, settlement and innovation. She is co-editor of the forthcoming volume Sayfo, Genocide in the Ottoman Empire, and in addition, she is the director of the Inanna Foundation, Netherlands. Thank you for coming.
Thank you very much for this introduction. In my paper, I would like to discuss the way collective memory about the Sayfo has been transmitted and reconstructed through narratives across generations, and more specifically, how these narratives have been articulated in Assyrian Syriac music, hereafter Assyrian music, in the diaspora in Surait Turoyo. I have based my analysis on lamentations and poetry produced in the ancestral homeland on 21 Sayfo songs in Surait and poems in Syriac produced in the homeland and in the diaspora, and some recent interviews I had with writers of these songs. I have also attended live performances of these songs. Before I continue, I would like to say that I approach all identities as temporary constructions and developed in a specific context. So I could use any of the names that is in use among our people, but for this specific presentation, I'm going to use a single name, Assyrian, to make it easier. First, I will discuss how silenced memories have continued to be transmitted across generations in the historical homeland, and secondly, I will elaborate on how emigration to Western countries dislocated this silence in public spaces and created space to perform songs about the Sayfo on stage for a broad audience. In the post-Sayfo period, the weak position in the political arena forced Syriac Orthodox church leadership to develop loyal relations with the new Turkish rulers. As the only remaining institutions of Assyrians, its loyalty to the Turkish rulers can be seen as a survival strategy. The hopeless situation of Assyrians directly after the genocide, therefore, provides the clue to understanding the silence in public of post-Sayfo generations. The church leadership silenced everything that could be dangerous for the survival of the remaining community members, avoiding any confrontation with the Turkish rulers. For example, Patriarch Elias III advised its flock not to develop close relations with Armenians and not to get involved in their movements, not even in their cultural activities such as music, which was then perceived as a symbol of national awakening. According to Zachariah Sharker, who was the secretary of Patriarch Elias III and his nephew, the Patriarch advised young community members to, I quote, you can read with me there, keep out of movements which trespass on Ottoman sensitivities, matters such as composing music. I see the Turkish state through the officials with whom I'm in contact. They regard the Armenians with extremely caution and through a finely focused microscope, unquote. It was thus because of such fears that the church leadership directed the community to focus on basic religious practices. Patriarch Elias III explained, I quote, "We have to safeguard the lives of the living because the dead are not going to come back," unquote. Assyrians living in Turkey had to carry on with their lives as survivors of a catastrophe. The silence of post-Sayfo generations in public in Turkey and in the Middle East needs to be understood in relation to the restrictive policies of Turkish regimes. Already in the first decades of the Turkish Republic, Turkish ruling elites had developed a policy to ban non-Turkish music in the eastern province of Turkey, Diyarbakir. It now becomes clear that Patriarch Elias advised to his people not to make music in the years immediately after the genocide was not merely based on his own fears, but was in actual fact a consequence of state policy. Patriotic songs and poetry were among the most important activities through which intellectuals and political leaders of different ethnic groups accommodated the romantic idea of national awakening in the pre- and post-Sayfo period, and because of this, these activities had also become subject to restrictive policies. According to the Turkish historian Ogur Ungur, an attempt in 1943 to establish a Diyarbakir music ensemble by the Turkish musician who was appointed to do so, Celal Güzelses, failed because of the previous expulsions of most remaining Christians in the decades after the genocide. A picture from 30 April 1914, 3 months before the First World War began, shows that Assyrians, and here it concerns the Syriac Orthodox, did have a music ensemble in Diyarbakir. After the war, there is no evidence of the existence of civic music among Assyrians in Turkey. Silence followed the Sayfo, as with those who had been killed, a culture disappeared, a style of life. Memories transmitted through lullabies and lamentations. It's necessary at this point to say something about how Sayfo memories have been transmitted across generations, how they are remembered and reconstructed by those who did not experience it, and most importantly, how these Sayfo memories have become part of every member of the community. With the absence of a collective of historical writings about the Sayfo, oral family stories have come to function as the communal memory of Assyrians. The stories express their sorrows about the past and fears for the future. Children are exposed to these stories from a young age. It's common among Assyrians to talk about the Sayfo, and more specifically about how family members were killed or disappeared. In an unpublished article, Malfono Mikhail Abdallah, who is present here, recalls, although this article it's not published in English, but it is published in Polish. So Malfono Mikhail Abdallah recalls memories from his childhood in Qamishlo, where many survivors sought refuge, including his grandparents. In an unpublished article, he thus writes about mothers who would express their sorrows as lamented lullabies to their children. You can read with me. I quote, "Instead of sweet lullabies suitable for its mental constitution, that child would listen to sorrowful lamentations, sung with tears in the singer's eyes, to a sad and melancholy tune until it fell asleep. The singer would lament over the murdered relatives, lost belongings, babies taken away by strangers from their mothers, over the life in exile or running for life in wilderness. Instead of lovely fairy tales, the child would listen to repetitive warnings that strangers could kidnap it," unquote. In a YouTube film, Archbishop Julius Jesuch, the former Archbishop of Central Europe and the Benelux, sings a lament which he remembers from his childhood. There is no time to to listen to it now, but here you can see the lyrics. That Diyarbakir black stone, they killed the deacons along with the priests. I cry for help, there is no cry for help. That Balalauke Diyarbakir, they killed the groom along with the bride. I cry for help, there is no cry for help. I checked what the term Balalauke means, and Malfono Michael went to Turabdin a couple of years ago. And we have Abuna here, maybe he can help us later in the questions-answer session. So Malfono Michael said that the people in Turabdin informed that it is a bush with beautiful, nice red berries. So here, the metaphor of Balalauke, or Salmune in Syriac, refers to the nice place of Diyarbakir and its the structure, therefore. After singing this lamentation, and it's in Kurdish, by the way, he sings it in Kurdish. He was born in Kafro, which was in which they used the Kurdish language. After finishing, he says emotionally, whenever she would sing it, one could not stop one's tears from running. The woman he refers to was probably a family member or another woman in the village Kafro Elaito, where he lived as a child until 1951. The use of lamentations as lullabies demonstrated the desperate situation in which the post-Sayfo generations lived their existential fears. As bearers of horrific memories, mothers and grandmothers expressed their sorrows to their children in the private home. Emigration of oral history. About 5 decades after the Sayfo took place, Assyrians moved from the periphery of agrarian societies in the Middle East literally into the most modern urban centers of the Western world. Their socio-political context had changed drastically. They were now settled in secular and democratic societies where people could express themselves openly. With the emigration, they also moved their collective memories into a new context of living. And their oral history dislocated, therefore, the discourses of silence and opened up the space for expressing their sorrow, and they have begun to talk openly about what had befallen their people. It was thus in Europe that the first eyewitness accounts began to be published, in the first in the original language in which the manuscripts were written, Syriac and Aramaic, and some decades later they were translated into Western languages in order to reach out to a broader audience. Simon Birol already mentioned a few. So among the first main publications about the Sayfo are 2 edited volumes by the late Archbishop Julius Cicek. I have written them down there. Although these publications reached a broader audience of Assyrians, they remained mostly within the community because they were written in Syriac. Interestingly, all these publications consist mainly of poetry that traditionally would be lamented if sung. The tradition of lamentations in Mesopotamia is very old. Communal laments play an important role in the formation of a collective memories of groups. They express complaint, sorrow, and grief over some perceived calamity, physical or cultural, which had befallen or was about to befall them, and to appeal to God for deliverance. There is a tradition among the Assyrians to perform poems about the Sayfo as communal lamentations sung by a singer who expresses the sorrow felt by his people. This may explain why most of the accounts about the Sayfo have been poems. The poems express the communal sorrow, grief, and mourning about their people. A few examples of these poems are about the killings of Christians, 1914, by monk Yohanan Kafroyo, And there is a very long lament by Isa Isler. His nickname was Isa Saqat. He released it on a cassette, and I believe that Jambi Sawi published it some years ago. Another well-known poem is the long poem by Gallo Shabo, which I believe he wrote in the beginning of the 1920s when he settled in the Shingal Mountains, home to the Yazidis, who protected them after they fled there. So before he resettled settled in Syria. So now I have 5 minutes remaining. Quickly, Sayfo songs in the Diaspora. So the early Sayfo songs released in the Diaspora have been strongly influenced by the lamentation tradition. The lyrics have been based on earlier lamentations written in the ancestral homeland or based on eyewitness stories heard or read. A characteristic of the lyrics is that they express grief and mourning about what had befallen the Assyrians during the Sayfo. The melodies are mournful and they are sung in Syriac, Aramaic language, Turoyo. Unlike the practice in the homeland, songs that have been produced since the 1980s in Europe have been performed on stage for a broader audience at parties, weddings, and accompanied by music. Their recordings have been disseminated within the community and subsequently at a later stage also on music cassettes, CDs, and through the internet, mostly YouTube. Especially music made available on the internet has reached the audience outside of the community. This can be considered as a new level of transmitting Sayfo memories. The technologies used to reach out to new and different audiences, something which had not been possible in the period before. In the Diaspora, the performed poems, lamentations, and songs about the Sayfo have functions as forms of closure. They are performed in a public space in which the audience can participate and relate to from an individual perspective while connecting to the collective Sayfo question and trauma. A well-known Sayfo song from the early 80s was written by Habsuno Baho. At the moment, he lives in Paderborn. It's called Sayfo da Alfo Chamo Arbahsar during the sword of 1914. Its lyrics indicate that it has been inspired by the earlier mentioned long poem by Gallo Shabo, written 5 decades earlier, so this indicates the transmission of memories. And I also know that his parents and grandparents have transmitted many of their memories about the Sayfo to him. The song consists of 4 stanzas and expresses several themes which are common in many Sayfo songs. I will not read the text. So the first line of the song identifies the Sayfo of 1914 among the earlier Sayfo, setting the scene for the lamented. Thereafter, the song informs the listener about the great number of killings, the unequal balance between perpetrators and victims in the battles, and the absence of anyone offering help to the victims. Thus, the voice of the singer is turned to God as the only one who could offer help. In the following stanza, the singer sings about how horrific the killings were and the extent of the destruction of churches and monasteries. The instrument of killing, the sword, is mentioned both as a symbol of Islam, a religious discourse which is central to all writings about the Sayfo, and as a tool of killing. This reinforces the dominant image among Assyrians of having been slaughtered. Principally, it explains why the Assyrian genocide has been referred to in terms of sword, Sayfo. The metaphor of lambs is used to underline the innocence and defenseless position of the slaughtered victims. And this catastrophe was so awful that even the rocks witness to the killings and normally used as a metaphor for being emotionless cried about the victims. A characteristic of Sayfo songs from this period is that they use elements of the geography where the Sayfo took place as geographical witnesses of the Sayfo. In the songs, the white snow is turned into red snow, the river into a red river, and the earth into a red earth. People who grew up in Turabdin in the post-Sayfo period heard many stories about how people were thrown into a specific well in the village, or how people were collected in the church and burned. The Sayfo and the geographical history has therefore become intertwined. Modern narrators of Sayfo memories towards the second half of the 1990s, we can observe a change in the lyrics and styles of some of the Sayfo songs in the Diaspora. They are no longer sung in the earlier lamenting style, but are sung in a more active, determined and proud voice to a broad audience. The lyrics do no longer stress just the position of being victim of genocide, but they also express the will to bring about positive change in their position in society. The discourses in the songs go beyond the pain. They call for activism, to no longer accept the position of being subjected to oppression. The song by George Farage, Abri, which means my son, has left a strong impression on me. It's a very interesting one. The first part of this song is a recitation introducing the listener to the theme of his song by communicating respectively with the victims who experienced the Sayfo themselves. George Farage's text is a clear example of the mediation of the past, not by recall, but by imaginative investment, projection, and creation. In the stanzas thereafter, George Farage thinks to his son about his witness, memories of what had befallen his people, and requests his son to make the promise to always be there when they need his help, to take the role of the activist as he himself has done by mediating his ideas through his songs. We don't have the time to read this. So I will conclude. So George Farage communicates his discourse on the Sayfo question to present and future generations. He asks his son to promise to not forget the Sayfo martyrs, symbolized as his country, and not to express any oppression any longer. I will not discuss the post-memory in rap songs, but the rap songs, they go a step further. It's an angry genre. It urges changes, and it's very much on communication with the outsiders, because the insiders are well informed about the pain of the people, but the outsiders not yet. And a rap aims at reaching out to these outsiders. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Naues, for your insightful lecture. And now we are coming to our second speaker. It is Timon Bada. I hope I will pronounce it correct. He's from the University of Leiden, and his lecture is about the poems of Rataz Magdisi Elias and the remembrance of a region of the past. Timon Bada received his master's degree in religious studies from Leiden University, focusing on Christianity and the Middle East. Now he is doing a PhD at the same university about the use of Arabic and Syriac by Syriac Christian authors in early 20th century in northern Iraq. The PhD is a part of a larger project that studies the way non-Muslims in the mandatory Middle East and Arabic and other languages to position themselves vis-à-vis the states they lived in. Welcome, Mr. Bada.
Thank you very much for the introduction. In 2008, the well-known Syriac Orthodox poet Ghattas Maqdisi Ilyas, also known as Manfono Denho, died after a very long life. Not long before his death, he said in an interview that he never wrote something about the Sayfo, even though he was very much affected by it. Still, there are some clear references in his work to it, and as an author was considered very important in the 20th century revival of the classical Syriac language. And also as somebody who had a very large interest in the Arabic language, and writing only 15 years after the Sayfo, his poems do provide a valuable perspective on the way the region of Tur Abdin is remembered. Ghattas Ilyas was born in 1911 in a Syriac Orthodox family in the city of Midyat, heart of the Tur Abdin region, and he was born on the eve of the First World War. It broke out when he was only 3 years old, which so massively struck the region. In 1915, when Midyat was hit, he had fled to Ain Bardo, and at the age of 7, in 1918, he fled again to Adana, which has then come under French control after the signing the Treaty of Sèvres. I went to the orphanage there. It's quite a well-known orphanage, and some things have already been said about it during this conference. But in 1921, he had to flee again to Damascus because the region of Cilicia became part of the Republic of Turkey. In Damascus, he would stay till 1980, when he finally moved to Brazil and never to move again to the Middle East. In 2008, I said he died, and having received great respect as a key player in the revival of the classical Syriac language. Ghattas Ilyas did not have a possibility of writing his profession. He spent most of his time as a tax officer in Syria, but he chose to write intensively during a few short periods. And he still was a prolific author, having produced numerous poems and pieces of prose. And in 1988, a collection of poems was published by Bar Hebreus Verlag. That's a publishing house belonging to the Syriac Orthodox monastery Mor Ephraim in the Netherlands. It's called Tugone. Can be translated something like Deep Thoughts. And it contains many poems and a smaller number of pieces of prose from his early period in the Middle East, Syria and Lebanon, and later period in Brazil. It was produced, as many of these volumes, also by the former Syriac Orthodox Archbishop of the Netherlands, Mor Julius Jesu Cicek. So it's the third time today that we talk about him. All pieces are his work of Ghattas Ilyas, and all are written in classical Syriac, except for the first few pages which are written in Arabic. Today I would like to focus on one aspect of Ghattas' poetry, the remembrance of Tur Abdin as a region of the past. So today, when people are with their origins in Tur Abdin are slowly coming back for a visit or for good, it does not appear to be the perspective of Ghattas. So his poems, together with things he said in some interviews, suggest that for him Tur Abdin is a region of the past. still existing in his memory, and that the future of the nation of Shoryoye can still be bright, but that it lives somewhere else than in Turabin. Ratas never wrote about the Cipher explicitly, and he also asserts that in an interview. And as a reason he gives that he was too young at that time to remember it correctly. But nevertheless, Sayfo is surely present in the poetry in an implicit way. First of all, say something about the reasons Ratas gave himself for writing and publishing the poetry. Then I will explore through his poems the theme of remembrance of the region of his youth, Turabdin, but also Adana, as well as the theme of elevation of the nation, and that latter theme is very clearly present in his poetry. Ratas Ilyas is regarded as one of the pioneers of the revival of classical Syriac language in the 20th century. This volume is a good example of that. So all poems in the volume are in the traditional genre of madrashe, but the content is by no way formulaic, and he was setting an example of how to write new non-religious works in the classical Syriac language. In his introduction, the author sees his volume explicitly as a contribution to Syriac literature. So the first few pages of the volume are said in Arabic, and those pages give an introduction to the Syriac language. And more importantly, it ends with the importance that the language is actually used by authors. So he writes, I quote, "I use this opportunity to urge intellectuals and writers to learn the language." And then he said that he does this hoping that I contributed a stone to the high building of its literature, the Syriac literature, paying back part of my large debt that had been on my shoulders for many years. So he sees writing these poems in Syriac as a way to do something back for his nation. And the fact that this part is written in Arabic suggests that he wrote it for readers who cannot read Syriac, either for people outside the communities or inside the communities who did not learn classical Syriac, hoping that it would inspire the reader to learn the language. After this introduction in Arabic, another introduction in Syriac follows, and he tells a longer personal story about his own history with the Syriac language. And again, he mentions that he sees his work as a necessary way of paying back his debt to the nation, and he uses the word umtho in Syriac. He also explains that he wrote the first set of poems in his youth, when he was at school, so it must be in Damascus as well as in Beirut, and how much he regrets is that he could not do it for a long period because of what he calls the administrative work that subjected me for 40 years. So that's his service as a tax officer. Even at an old age, after his arrival in Brazil, he was encouraged by his wife, he said, to continue writing these poems, and he expresses the hope that it would even not be the last of his works. So let us now look at one of the key poems of Ratas' early period, from the 1930s, when he was still in the Middle East. The poem is called Turabdin. It's the longest of the volume with 13 stanzas. And it's written from a first-person perspective, and it seems to reflect closely his own ideas, so the ideas of the author himself. So it can be seen in a way as an autobiographic poem, I would say. It describes various aspects of the region. So he starts with a description of the beauty of the region, about the nature, about the food it provides. He mentions the presence of monasteries and monks and their cells in the field and the churches in the cities. He gives a special attention for the city of Midyat, where he came from. He calls it my marvelous city, heart of the land, and he describes it as a queen keeping her eye on the valley. In the 7th stanza, he praises the region for having produced not only great writers, but also powerful people, having suffered great pains, and he refers to the fact that they have kept their orthodoxy, and it was a reason, as he said, that for which their graves were mocked. So if not explicit, this might be a hidden reference to Sayfo, even though it might of course also refer to the period before. The stanza that follows, he continues about those people. He calls them Benaye Dorom, a way of referring to Aramaic people. And he says, I cite, the Armenians who created civilization and who gave to the world the marvelous gift of writing. This is the only case that I've seen in Ilyas' poems that he refers to an Aramean identity. Because in all the other cases he uses the word Suryoyo, and in Arabic he uses Suryani. Then a part follows in which the narrator addresses the reader in the second person. He says, "If the way of life in Turabdin pleases you, my Syriac brother," this was a quotation, and so referring to the people who return to that region. Then the narrator asks this Suryoyo brother if they arrive in his city of Midyat, to another quote, to make the glorious group of brothers remember him. Maybe they remember the child who left during the days of adversity. So this is a little bit more clear reference to the events of Sayfo. Again, not explicit, but it does correspond to an interview in which he told about his refutes from Midyat to Ainwardo. So again, the poem gives a strong suggestion that it was meant to be autobiographic. The rest of the poem is about the importance of Turabdin for the narrator's youth, and about the pain that the mountain of Turabdin is still carrying in the days that he was writing. So the Turabdin can be, in short, be seen as an autobiographic poem remembering the region of his youth and the city where he lived for the first 3 years of his life. The stanzas that address the reader, who might have the idea to go back to the region, confirms his statement in an interview that he never wanted to return to the region himself, because it was under Turkish administration. In the poem, so the narrator invites other people to go there, but he clearly has no intention himself to do so. Turabdin is a nostalgic poem, so writing about the beauty, the good things of the region, but also about the pain that it carries. But there are more poems in the volume, also of this early time from the 20s and the 30s, in which he brings the region from which he fled into remembrance. One of them, a relatively long one and quite an interesting one, is called Madrashto de Beit Yathme, School of the Orphanage. It was written in 1913, can also be seen as an autobiographic poem. He writes probably about the orphanage in Adana, where he remained from 1918 to 1921, from the age of 7 through 10. And in this poem, he addresses the school directly, and he describes it in quite an emotional style and in very warm terms. But as important as that, in the poem, the nation again plays a very important role. And we have already seen the presence of the nation in the Turabdin poem, but in this poem, Ilyas mentions the school directly, explicitly as the means of liberation of the nation away from slavery, Abdutho. And the last poem that I will touch upon is called Compatriots, Benai Motho, from 1931, same period. It's a very short poem, and he makes a wish, the narrator makes a wish from the nation, for the nation very clear. He writes, it's a translation, let's get together, compatriots, let's do our best for a nation zealously. And then let's get back to the honor of our ancestors quickly, up to eminence. Ghadas Ilyas shows with this poem, and another poem as well called The Youth, that I will not, Alain Mourtho, I will not go further into that he still has hope for the nation, even if it cannot reside anymore in the lands of Turabdin. To conclude, Ghadas Ilyas is careful not to touch explicitly the events of Sayfo in his poems in the Tugone volume, and having declared that he refrained to do so on purpose. But reading the introduction, he wrote to the volume in Arabic and Syriac. His purpose for writing and publishing poems is clear: to contribute to literature in classical Syriac and to propagate its usage for the nation. The poems are strong in the theme of bringing the nation to a higher level. He is not explicit what he means by this nation, by the umtho, but he consistently uses the word suryoyo. And as I said, in an isolated case, he refers to an Aramean identity. Writing this literature is his contribution in helping this happen. But nevertheless, by doing that, with poems such as Turabdin and the School of the Orphanage, Ghadas Ilyas does not only refer to Turabdin as an important area in the common consciousness for Suryo-Yutho, Syriac culture, but he also brings certain episodes of the years 1915 through 1923 to memory, be it in very subtle words. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bada, for your interesting lecture. Our third speaker will be Tala Jarjo from the University of Notre Dame from the United States, and she will speak about loss, survival, and the historical narrative of Chant. Tala Jarjo is currently assistant professor in the Department of Music and concurrent assistant professor in the Department of Anthropology of the University of Notre Dame, where she is also a fellow of the Medieval Institute, the Kellogg Institute for International Studies, and the Grog Institute for Peace Studies. She taught at New York University for NYU Abu Dhabi and earned her PhD from the University of Cambridge. Her article titled Khasho, Music, Modality, and the Economy of Emotional Aesthetics appeared recently in the Journal of the British Forum for Ethnomusicology Forum. Welcome, Tala.
Thank you very much for this most generous introduction. A quick word of thanks for the organizers of this conference. It has been a true privilege to be here. Thank you very much for that. I just wanted to say a couple of things before I begin. One of them is that the paper I'm reading this morning is part of an ongoing work on the concept of identity in the Syrian Orthodox tradition of chanting. And I will be using the word Syriani, which is, as somebody most eloquently put it recently, no more or less problematic than any other term, but it's particularly suitable in the case of talking about the Urfelli community, which is a community that emigrated from Urfa to Hayy Syrian in Aleppo. So Syriani is the word by which each member of the community, as well as the community collectively, are known happily. So I will just use that term because it's convenient and suitable. The church is full. Balcony, aisles, staircases, and window bays. No place to sit or stand. Shoulders crowd together along rows of worshippers who arrived early to line the overflowing pews. It is Shubkono night at St. George's, the once-a-year service on the eve of Great Lent. Starting tonight, the faithful will fast for 40 days and will be instructed to visit church daily for prayer and repentance, in preparation for communion on the most important occasion in the Syriac calendar, Easter Mass. Shubkono, or forgiveness, is a much anticipated yearly service at the height of which the bishop kneels, bringing his face to the ground 3 times. On this occasion, the church's most senior cleric asks forgiveness from the people for his sins, and they grant it. The act of asking forgiveness, first from fellow humans and second from God, is at the heart of this service. The biblical readings and the sermon are on the subject of love and forgiveness. John 1, Corinthians 1, and Matthew. The bishop is not the only one to kneel for forgiveness on Shubkono. The whole church follows, performing the 40 bows of Lent in the first of no less than 40 repeats. While the bishop recites proper texts between his 3 silent bows, the church sings when bowing collectively 40 times. Following the bishop's lead and facing the altar, everyone recites the most important Kyrie in the ecclesiastical calendar. Moving together at the melodic cues and drawing the sign of the cross with each bow, the church sings in unison 40 musical phrases to the words Kyrie eleison, Moran etraham alein, Moran hus urahim alein, Moran anin urahim alein. Orphelis told me it is very important that they attend this service. Few manage to attend the office daily throughout Lent, but everyone attends Shubkono. As there are 2 Syriac Orthodox churches in Aleppo, the bishop leads one Shubkono service on Monday evening and another on Tuesday morning to accommodate all members. Orphelis prefer to attend this service at their church, St. George's of Hayy Suryan, which is home to their closely knit community. Following in the bishop's example, worshippers also ask forgiveness from one another before retiring to their home. I was told that individuals who have had major differences are especially expected to address one another at this occasion. This rite prepares the faithful to begin the spiritual journey of Lent as a community and as individuals. Starting the next day, a noontime daily service, which St. George's observes only during Lent, is home to the 40 bows. Professionals are known to obtain hourly leaves from work to take part in this service. It is a very special service, one woman told me. I would only miss it if I am too ill to go to church. I feel sorry for people who work in the morning and cannot be there every day, she continued. Ordinary office prayers, which at St. George's are grouped in 2 morning and evening daily services, usually have a small attendance. Special services, however, such as Shubkono, are hugely popular annual events. During Lent, the church introduces a 3rd service at midday because performing the bows attracts seasonal worshippers. Syrianis take this practice so seriously, particularly during Shubkono, that in some churches the pews are replaced with rugs to allow kneeling in prostration. The lower the bow, the more acceptable the penitence, some believe. Showing humility is essential in the sincere confession of wrongdoing. I have witnessed the bows in more than one Syriani church and noticed different forms of bowing that range from lowering the head forward to kneeling all the way to the ground. Older members of the community and more senior clerics bowed as far down as they physically could, some bringing their foreheads to the ground. This is the correct way, said a retired senior deacon who attended midday office daily. It is not easy, especially when you haven't eaten all morning, but that is part of Lent, he explained. While younger members typically minimized the physical movement, they spoke of the practice with no less reverence. This is a very important part of my faith, I was told by one college student who went to church when he had no morning classes. Clergy and the older people like to bow all the way, the same way monks did in the early days of our church, he explained. It is good, I think, but it is not obligatory. I just bow my head and draw the cross. I like to do this when I'm fasting. It gives me a special feeling of devotion. For the Syriani church, one of a long history of arduous asceticism and various forms of early monastic practices, the fact that worshippers are keen to maintain a penitential practice reminiscent of their early legacy is hardly surprising. What was surprising to me, however, was that Urfellis maintain this reverence even when they have lost affiliation with the church. The Syriac Catholics and evangelicals in Hayy Surian, for instance, are also Urfelli and have churches there. I have on occasion seen members of non-Orthodox denominations practicing the vows. When I discussed this observation with the wife of a non-Orthodox cleric who rarely visits St. George's, she said that this is a part of her that she feels missing. Because her denominational affiliation does not allow what are perceived as ritualistic elements from pre-Reformation traditions, such as icons, incense, and the drawing of the sign of the cross, she thinks she should not be seen performing the vows so as to not elicit criticism from the zealous evangelicals. Indeed, a fellow cleric's wife attends midday service on occasions, sings along as a native, but does not perform the vows or draw the sign of the cross. These women expressed a sense of regret at not being able to maintain what they described as authentic Christian practice, one found only at the origin, al-asl, to which they or their families once formally belonged. Speaking in Arabic, the women emphasized authenticity and originality, using words for authentic such as asil and original, asli, that share the same linguistic root and imply leading to one place, the root. The ladies' comments reiterate a common view in the Syriani church, whereby the church lays claim to authenticity, particularly in terms of liturgy and music. The significance of the women's sentiment, especially in connection to this Kyrie, lies in the implied originality it attaches to the Syriani faith. Equal to all Urfellis, the attachment to the women expressed to the faith of their ethnic church is significant because it predates that of their espoused denominations. They are currently members of denominations with differing theologies, yet, when it comes to the 40 vows of Lent, a particular attachment to the old faith surfaces. An attachment that is not contingent on denominational affiliation, but one that is basic, spiritual, inherited, and very old. The sentiment they express with relation to this hymn is one the women present as a given, a kind of truth. It relates to something they are by virtue of belonging to the Urfelli faith, something that is missing in their more recent Christian spiritualities. The Lent Kyrie is, in other words, a marker of something asli, original, that is beyond the asil, the authentic, something that is almost ontological. While faithful members of newer Christian communities, they do not wish to lose connection to the spiritual affiliation of origin. They yearn to experiencing it yearly and try to maintain it by partaking in the Lent Kyrie. It is hard to express what I mean in words, one woman said. Only in the Syriani church do I feel this. It is not something that can be given, nor can it be taken away, something only the Syriani have, she continued, with an innocently conspiratorial hint. Seen in this light, the Urfelli Syriani sense of spirituality and ownership of the Christian faith is specific and select, but not condemningly exclusive. Unlike certain later faiths, it does not discount others from the realm of divine blessing, which, from Edessa, extends to all Christianity. Yet, by laying claim to one early blessing, this spiritual state of being assumes it is the origin, a privilege which defines how members of this church distinguish themselves from those who implicitly do not belong. This state of spirithood is contingent on and maintained by what forms the essence of Urfelli Syrianiness, which is essentially the Syriani conception of identity. The Syriani community of St. George's Church in Aleppo is a migrant community. They left southern Turkey a few years after the end of the war, continuing to feel imminent threats. Having originated in ancient Edessa, where the then Urfa stands today, hence the attributive Orfelli, the majority of this community belonged to the Syrian Orthodox Church of Antioch. Like many fleeing Christian groups in the southeast of Turkey, the Orfelli Suryanis settled in northern Syria, but unlike many communities who were scattered quickly, Orfellis remained largely together and set up camp at the outskirts of Aleppo. Their religious leaders eventually acquired a piece of land via negotiation with the Italian consulate in the city. Orfellis initially built wooden houses with tin roofs on a triangular piece of land that was, and still is, defined by clear boundaries. As the community settled, this ghetto gradually took the shape of a neighborhood, which holds, to this day, their name, Hayy Suryan, the neighborhood of the Suryani people. The practice of Syriac chant, as I presented in this paper, is a process by which an Orfelli Suryani identity, a certain Suryaniness, is articulated and affirmed in the community's spiritual space, particularly, but not exclusively, in worship. This Suryaniness is defined by a number of factors, some of which are controversial, namely those with geopolitical implications, such as territorial claims and nationalistic overtones. The religious element, however, which is the early Christian connection to indigenous Levantine roots, is an essential component of the Suryani identity that is equally accepted by Suryanis and non-Suryanis. So from a general point of view, studying Syriac chant with respect to the question of Suryaniness is important, not only because studies of music in relation to religious identities in the region are scarce, but also given the number of different religions comprised in communities that have been largely defined along secular lines since the end of the 19th century, such as nation-states and ethnic groups. As the question of Syriac chant and identity merits a long discussion, this short paper restricts itself to a few elements of a larger argument, which is an essentially ethnomusicological one. Within an established subfield in current music studies, the study of music and identity attempts to answer a subset of questions that form part of an ethnomusicological approach, which, at least since the 1980s, considers music within the complexity of its social and cultural milieu. Based on context, scholarship in this approach lends particular attention to how music relates to social matters and to the given community's realm of cosmological speculation. For those interested, I'm referring to works by Anthony Seeger, Tim Rice, and Stephen Feld. Recognizing the difficulty of defining the scope and meaning of identity, studies focus on various elements such as ethnicity, gender, nationality, and sexuality. Within this group, studying music as identity marker for ethnic and religious communities is a relatively recent idea that has been attracting increasing scholarly attention since the early 1990s. It explores connections between music and what constitutes locally perceived identity markers. While typically underlining markers that are appropriate to the communities in question, which may vary among diverse communities, the various studies in this line seem to share one notion: the attempt to define difference. In other words, people's desire to perceive themselves as communities by virtue of what they set themselves apart, by virtue of what, sets them apart from others, is the most common trait to differing processes of local internal identification. This notion is fundamental to what the current paper argues in terms of recognizing the identifying elements of Orfelli Suryaniness in relation to place. With this in mind, it must be noted that some of these elements are shared with the other Suryani and non-Suryani Christian communities in the region, marking thus one level of determining difference, while also considering attributes that the Orfelli believe set them apart, rather distinguish them in a privileged manner within the wider Suryani realm. For instance, one might look at the local terms for a performed Syrianiness as they are manifested through key linguistic expressions which symbolize local practices and value systems. Drawing on ethnographic observation and analysis, I replaced the problematically universal term identity with the locally constructed concepts of being and belonging. In doing so, I argue that chant bridges modes of being and forms of belonging, respectively wujud and intima, and that the differentiating characteristic of this conceptual synthesis in the Orfelli context is a certain auto-reference to an ancient and special divine blessing which affords the tradition bearers grounds for laying claim to a perceived by default originality. While the Syriani part of these characteristics may apply to all Syriac chant, I think we can see the significance of this synthesis in the Orfelli case through the 40 bows of Lent. It should be borne in mind that while a special blessing is specific to Orfellis, the above-mentioned synthesis must be understood within the wider historical and spiritual context of the Syriani Church. Adopting a historiographic and ethnographic starting point, let me briefly outline the two major elements of the Syriani identity: the notion of existence and an ecclesiastical lineage traceable to the earlier Christians. In combining these two elements, Syrianiness may be seen as a state of demographic being that reciprocates legitimacy with a spiritual belonging. While the value of the latter surpasses worldly forms of existence, implicit to the former, it remains nevertheless expressed by them. Chant is key to this process of legitimation. The combinatory state is reconstructed through memory and imagination as its two components are attached to a sort of place that may be considered at once historical, real, and wished for, imagined. That is Urfa, that is Edessa, rather. While the relevance of this proposition varies among Syriani communities, it is particularly poignant in the Orfelli case, where Edessa provides the place, the prototype historical locale to which this Syrianiness belongs, and from which Edessan chants continue as resounding evidence. This is, therefore, a discussion of being and belonging through the Syriani understanding of their history as a Christian lineage attached to a historical place that is maintained by perpetual reconstruction. For understanding this complex state in context, I employ, instead of the conventional term identity, the terms being, wujud, and belonging, intima. I consider the former as being manifested by the sheer continuation of existence, a historic continuity, while the latter is a local performative process by which symbols of Syrianiness converge in an intimate reconstructive assertion of the spiritual community through musical rituals such as the 40 bows. Edessa and its glorious early Christian legacy, in this sense, are lived, relived, and continuously inhabited at St. George's Church of Hayy Syrian in perhaps equally strong and intense ways to the experience of any spiritual space that constructs a far more certain reality than that of any pain, however real or oppressive it might be. Thank you.
Thank you, Tala, very much for this interesting lecture. Now, unfortunately, the time is coming to an end, and I beg now the speakers to come to the table, and you will now have the possibility to put questions to the speakers.
Regarding the speech made by Norris about the Syriac lamentation, in support to speech, I would like to raise 2 points. You spoke about the role of communal lamentation, about the influence by the lamentation tradition. I would like just to give maybe an example about it. In many lamentations, they referred a lot of time to the Bible, and especially to the Ancient Testament, mentioning the book of Jeremiah, the book of Jeremiah, and Rachel, and the tragedy of her girls. And the second element, we have a same kind of lamentation in Surah. The same, exactly the same. I would like just to mention Qasha Yonan. The term used by in Surah is durukta. And Israel Odo, in his book about describing the genocide, finished his book by some lamentation, and we have too many lamentation mentioned by Ishaq Armeli in his book Al-Khusara fi Nakabat al-Nasara. Thank you very much.
Thank you for enriching what I already, discussed. Actually, in a longer version, I do refer to Jeremiah and so on. And many of these laments are rich with the idea that the end of days is close, and especially Gallo Shabo's poem is very rich. But thank you, Malfoun, and also for referring to the Surith Madan Hoyo poetry in this genre. Thank you.
This also for Nurit. I just wanted to make just an observation that when you say that they were laments, of all these terrible things, and instead of lovely fairy tales, if you look at some of the old lovely fairy tales, they were full of horror. I mean, mothers were being killed and planted under trees, and then trees growing, and so there were a lot of horror in the children's tales, and I'm not sure exactly why children are subjected to this kind of thing, but it's very interesting.
But maybe I mean, so there could be these nice fairy tales, but maybe the ones full of horror. Again, which you think are most, I mean, they could be indeed, again, expressions of the sorrow of these mothers, and so it could be part of the same genre, indeed.
Actually, fairy tales usually have a happy ending. It's full of horror, and then they have a happy ending.
Yeah, thank you for the really wonderful presentations. Noura's citing from Mikhail really brought tears into my eyes, because I remember those lullabies still. But my point is my comment is to Tala. In Turabdin we say to the Syriac language is Lishono or Hoyo. How much the classical language, which is the dialect back to the second century, how much the Syriac language plays a role in these narratives, because the Urfa community mostly spoke Turkish, and in Aleppo they spoke Arabic, and I lived in the US among also Urfali, so what is the role of Syriac?
That is a very good question, and I don't have a short answer for it, but I will try. You're right, they spoke all sorts of languages from people around them, which is why Syriac means a lot to them. So I think in the 70s there was a movement to translate liturgy into Arabic or into the local languages, and that definitely happened in Syria. But slowly after that, they started retranslating into Syriac. So they use Syriac as much as possible. This is all within the church, right? This is all liturgy and singing in church. So they use Syriac as often as possible and as much as possible, even though they don't understand a single word. Only the clergy do. So ironically, in Tur Abdin, people make fun of the Syrianis in Halab, because they say they make all these mistakes, but it actually doesn't really matter, because what really matters to them is that it's Syriac. So this is a very, very short and simple answer. I hope it satisfies the question.
The next one is the lady in red in the last rows. Yeah, take it and bring it to the lady in the last row.
Thank you all for your lovely presentations. I really enjoyed them. My questions are for Tayman and Nowruz. They're both sort of comparisons to the Iraqi context. For Tayman, I'm wondering if there's so his poem about 1934, is there the Semel massacre, is there any influence on that? Because if you look in the Diaspora, I can think of a poem, a collection of poems from Iran, or from Chicago, published from the community in Iran around that period as well. So there might be some memories that are brought forth from Sayfo when Semel happens, and of course there's movements of populations also from Iraq to Syria, new settlements that are happening due to that. So there could be some kind of connection. I'm not sure if you found that. And to Nowruz, so the second half of your presentation, which I do some work on songs in the Iraqi context in the second half of the 20th century. I'm wondering if in Iraq, for example, the people are not so fluent in their language. I mean, of course they speak it, they're fluently speaking it, but they're not, the younger generation especially, they're not writing it, so they cannot really necessarily, they're not as fluent in it as they are in Arabic at this point, right? They've become urbanized and there aren't as much opportunities for them to learn it in a standardized school setting. So music becomes this other form of sort of expressing their culture and also in their native tongue, and there's also this high and low culture also, you know, if you're not able to write in it, but you can, so there could be, I'm not sure if there's similar connections in Qamishli as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your question. I'm sure it doesn't stand on its own, and we also saw the comparison that's already there with the other literature coming from this region. But I don't have enough sight on the literature you're mentioning. So we'd really love to see references to this literature from Iran, from Chicago, to see if you can make this comparison. Thank you.
Thank you for your question, Alda. Actually, George Farage, in this song of his, My Son, he does refer to Simele as well. He asked his son, do you know how many, I think it's how many have been killed between the Sayfo and Simele and thereafter and so on. So that is one. And then language use. Yeah, so those who have started to rap, they either intertwine Syriac, Aramaic, and European languages, or they use only European languages, and it has two main reasons, I think. One is because they don't speak their former mother tongue so well anymore, and the second is sometimes they do want to reach out to a broader audience, more specifically to the Westerners, and therefore they use these, for example, Gabi Konda, he was born in Lebanon but lives now in Sweden, and apparently his family circle did not communicate about the Sayfo to him while he was in Lebanon. So at the age of 22 in Sweden, he hears about the Sayfo and he becomes very angry, and he said, that's my motivation for this rap song. So when he directs himself to Turkey, he sings in English, and when he directs himself to the Syriac youth, he speaks in Syriac Aramaic, like let's get together and request our rights, and we shouldn't accept this anymore. So this in short, thank you.
question. The next question, please.
Yeah, I would like to thank you so much, Tala, for bringing this topic. And as I said yesterday, that we were missing to talk about the experience of Hayy Syrian, or the Syrian neighborhood, which is a camp. And I don't think that there is a similar experience with the Sayfo experience, that they move and they kept everything. And I hope that with Noriko that we would hear something about this very interesting and fascinating example of Hayy Syrian. What I would like to tell you that as I'm from Aleppo but not from Hayy Syrian, I was always astonished with their interest in music, and they have these bands like these historic Syriac names, Beth Nahrin, and all this, something linked with Saint Ephraim, with Edessa. And then we have the most important, Nouri Iskandar, who is the conservatoire director from Hayy Syrian community. And I challenge any other Syriac community in the world that they did no notification for the Beth Gazo except in this very interesting camp. My question is to you, and maybe has something to do with Nauras also. What is the connection between music and the trauma therapy, especially that most of this topic has something to do with lamentation? And I do remember that when they did the 75 years of anniversary after they left Edessa, so they revived some of these old songs that they had to say it when they left Edessa. So they say, goodbye Edessa, we are leaving you, and all these very touching words. But I was always astonished that the people, the children of Hayy Syrian, are always interested in music, and they send their children to conservatoire with something that we're not interested, for example, in the other parish, of which is Saint Ephraim, that we come from different Bengals. So what is really the connection between music and trauma therapy, especially in the case of Hayy Syrian? Thank you.
Well, I thought it was, well, I indicated in my presentation that it's very much related, and but for some singing, lamenting may help as a therapy. For others, it may not. Janu may also be able to talk about that from a more psychological perspective. I mean, as Malfono Habib said yesterday, when his father and grandfather left Tur Abdin in the years during the First World War, during the Sayfo, and settled in Lebanon, they did not want to go back to it. So some people continue to communicate about it, and others don't. So it may work differently for different people. So.
I have to say that I haven't done any work on music being, and trauma therapy. So I'm by no means versed in that. But there's no question about the fact that in the case I will address the second part of your question, the part that's that's related to the Orfelli context. There is no question about the fact that singing together brings the community, I mean, that's what I hope I sort of try to allude to, is that singing together in the language of what Edessa has given humanity, as Malfono rightly said, is extremely important and extremely meaningful. In a way, it takes the community outside of any context of pain and displacement and so on, and puts them in an ideal sort of place that is close to the next world. It's a transcending experience. It really transcends pain. In that sense, it doesn't reckon with pain in the therapeutic sense, but it sort of it rises above it. At least that's my understanding. I have to say that memories in Hayy Syrian, at least insofar as I encountered, did not mention Sayfo. There could be many reasons for that, but I don't think that the Orfelli community has been traumatized in the same way that other communities have. And please correct me if that is historically inaccurate, but it was not a topic that was subject to frequent conversations, And so it wasn't one that I broached. And I am now curious as to why that is. So I would like to consider that, in light of what I've been learning in this conference, I have to say. But in any case, the ideal that Edessa represents transcends everything. In fact, according to what somebody from the neighborhood told me, it transcends what Urfa was. I mean, Urfa was not a happy place. The Syrianis in Urfa were marginalized, were not rich, were not powerful in any sense of the way. So my guess is that carrying this, or my take on this, is that carrying this glorious legacy from Edessa transcends rather all the above. So in a way, it's almost a counter sort of narrative to the narrative of recognizing trauma and treating trauma. But I don't know. Again, that take is largely born on the fact that I did not see expressions of Sayfo in any prominent way.
Yeah. And then Professor Yasmo after.
My question is mostly for Timon, but it's sort of following on from what Tala just said. You just said that you never saw, or you never came across any mention of Sayfo in a prominent way. And, Timon also mentioned that Danho Malfono Danho or Ghattas Maqsi Elias never wrote explicitly about the Sayfo. Now, okay, he was 4 years old when it happened. He probably didn't remember too much, but he did spend 3 years in the Assyrian orphanage school in Adana. And, one of his teachers would have been Morphiloxenus Yohanan Dolabani, who Simon Birol also mentioned, who also wrote, Morphiloxenus Yohanan Dolabani also wrote poetry, but he never wrote anything explicitly about the Sayfo himself. And this is something that I'm sort of struggling with. Why did the Urfalis never really mention the Sayfo? They witnessed the complete destruction of the Armenian quarter in Urfa when they rebelled, or resisted, actually, against the massacres and deportations. And, Malfono Danho would have heard stories from the people that he lived around. And Morphiloxenus Yohanan Dolabani would have been a witness. Why did they choose never to write about this or never to talk about this? Why is it not a huge part of their identity or of their own narrative as Suryoye or as Suryanis or as Assyrians or as whatever? Why is it not part of their story?
Yeah. Thank you. I think it is indeed the reason he gives for not talking about Sayfo is indeed, as you say, that it was too long ago for him, that he was only 3 years old. But at the same time, he writes this very long poem about Turabdin, and he has only been there before his third, before all this happened. So it cannot be really the reason that he doesn't talk about it. Yeah.
Actually, perhaps I could add, because I'm just now in the process of looking into Holocaust survivors and how they have dealt with the past. So apparently there are some survivors that try to protect their children and try to survive and not to communicate about the horrific past. So in order to continue on with life, they try to educate their children and to not talk about the past, but to focus on the positive things and aspects in life. It's also painful, but they may also use it as a strategy to catch up with life. I think this is an aspect that we could.
Do you know if those people talk about the past, the positive things of the past, instead, like how does Elias?
So this is like. We should compare things more, in detail and more broadly. But yes, so like the lyrics in the songs that I discussed, having left the ancestral homeland, people sing in romantic terms about the past and so on. They don't sing about the horrific hard times that they had in a specific genre about the homeland, for example, and so it's a different aspect and different genre of singing, I think.
Perhaps we can shorten the answers because there are many questions in the audience. The next one is Professor Jastrow.
I have a very short.
We will end, but we have 5 questions now.
I have a short question to Tala. You have described in very impressive and in fact emphatic way the unique purity and of the religious tradition among the Edessa Christians, and of course Edessa is also the home of the Syriac, of the Syrian language, of the classical Syrian language. So can you explain why the Urfali Christians have not preserved their spoken language?
Wow. I don't know. I would be speculating. One of the hardest things about reconstructing a story from Edessa, from Urfa, is that there are so many gaps in the history. In fact, even the sheer task of identifying the churches and where they are has been, surprisingly complicated. So this is a huge leap of speculation. My guess, and I'm basing this on the fact that people told me that when they were in Urfa, they did not have access to education and they were very oppressed and very poor. And they were considered part of an Armenian minority in some sense, is that there was some sort of affinity or affiliation or integration there going on. There's also, historically, we don't know how long they have been living in Edessa for, so they might have come in and out often enough times to not speak the language. There's perhaps also the simple fact that Syriac is a literary dialect. It's not a spoken dialect. So it may well have, and I would send this question back to its source. In fact, I might be trespassing here on the experts' territory. So would you think that in a place where a literary language was devised, would that necessarily have relevance to what people speak? I don't know. I have no idea. But I wanted to say 2 quick points. Sayfo was not never mentioned. It was not never part of the picture, but it wasn't. The emphatically lamented side was the migration, al-hijra, right? So that is the part that they kept very dearly. And on that note, I want to emphasize the purity, because the purity is more of a construction than a real historical thing. So,
unfortunately, the time is over. You must continue your discussion outside. Thank you for your attention. Thank you, our speakers.